This video is about the types of services that you might be asked to provide during an escrow period for real estate transactions. So when someone buys a property, they have a period, which is called escrow, where they get to do their due diligence, inspections, things like that, and they can use the results of those inspections to negotiate a different price or credits or things like that from the seller of the property. The types of things that I've done during this period is either general, so just related to tree health, condition, impacts, conflicts, things like that, or it's related to construction. Because sometimes people buy properties with the intent to develop or improve upon them, and if they cannot do those things, then it's not worth it. And this is both on a homeowner level and a commercial level. The first category of inspections, that's related to general health and condition. One example is your most basic tree assessment. What is the health of these trees? Do they have any structural issues? How do I take care of them? Are they causing any conflicts with the existing structures? And if they are, how do I mitigate those problems? So this is the type of consultation that I've traditionally done with a tree service. And if you're attached to a tree service right now, that might be something that you offer as well. And it's same like with any other consultation. The only difference is that generally you do produce a report of some kind, because the written report is what the prospective buyer takes to the seller and tries to negotiate something. The prospective buyer can say, the tree work is going to cost this much because it hasn't been done. Can you give me X amount off the final price? If you're a consultant that doesn't do any tree estimates, then you can't put a number, or you should not be putting a number down on how much that tree work costs, because your opinion, unless you have a lot of estimating experience, is not really valid in that situation. In some cases, the seller may also choose to do that tree work in advance with their own people. Like, it kind of depends. Do they want the work done or do they want money off? If there's nothing too serious about that, the trees on that property, if they're pretty much fine, then it might just change to something like a discussion on what kind of work needs to be done in the future. How do they take care of these trees to make sure that they stay healthy? What are some potential things to consider in the future as the tree gets more mature? That's more of an informational thing, and the client may or may not want a report. I often get clients asking me about this kind of thing where they have a big tree next to a structure. The presence of a large tree next to a structure doesn't mean that it's automatically causing damage. So I like to tell clients that and let them know that I'm not going to be able to tell you an answer unless those roots are exposed, just because maybe the roots have been cut in the past for some other projects, and I don't want to condemn a tree just because it's close to a house. As part of that assessment, you might also note for the clients, are there any protected trees on the site, or regulated, or heritage, whatever that jurisdiction considers a tree that they want to pay special attention to. That last one, knowing what the regulated trees are for that particular jurisdiction, that overlaps with the next category of escrow type services, which is development. And it's common if you are in an area that is seeing more and more development, especially if you have tree protection requirements, that you get people who ask you questions about the feasibility of developing their site. This could be connected to the first category. So maybe you have a residential client who is looking at buying a property that they want to live in, but maybe in the future they want to develop this area in the back here or something like that. And sometimes you have really massive trees in the way, or maybe adjacent to that particular area where a client is interested in building. And that tree, if it's a nice tree, if they want to keep it, then they have to work around it, and that all increases the costs of this project. And maybe by increasing the costs, it's no longer economically feasible for them. So they may pass on that property and move on to other ones. If they want to build right up to a neighbor's tree and there's going to be issues with that, that's also something that you can let them know during that kind of inspection. And you can tell them high level without knowing what their project actually encompasses, what the limitations might be, just looking at the trees in the area. And this can be in two tiers. It could be the officially regulated trees by that jurisdiction. So if they're building near a tree that needs a permit, then that's a different tier. But there's also just being a good neighbor or working around trees that you want to keep on your own property, but you still want your development. These next three services are all kind of related. They're just different levels of the same due diligence. And this is what I've done for developers whose business it is to buy and develop properties. So they're more accustomed to doing a greater level of detail in their due diligence, and they're willing to pay because they have funds set aside for this kind of thing. It's much more expensive to buy a property, get deep into your design and investigation process, and then realize it's not feasible. So for them, it makes sense to invest extra money in the beginning stages before they've committed to the property. So the highest level one is just a quick walkthrough of the site, looking for trees that might present issues to their project. I've done projects where I walk the site and I note these are protected trees, they'll need a permit, maybe they're really big, maybe they're native species, and this jurisdiction really prioritizes keeping those trees. If they wanted to keep the tree, then they should build X feet away in one direction and X feet in these directions if they're committed to saving that tree. If they want to remove the tree, here's what it's going to look like. Are there any neighbor off-site trees that are going to be affected by the project? In which case, how far do they have to stay away from the property line to make sure that they're not impacting the trees more than they should? And they can take that to their designers, their engineers, or whomever, and say, working with these limitations, how many structures can I get on here? Can I build what I'm looking to build? And if the answer is no, then they make decisions based on that. I guess you could call the first tier like a level 1 version. You know how you have tree risk assessment? That's like a level 1 inspection. You're just doing a walkthrough. The second tier would be like a level 2 where you're inspecting each tree. And for this one, I've done actual tree inventories. So I'll give them a proposal for what it would cost for me to do a full arborist report and tree protection plan. What I'll do is just the first part. So I'll go to a site, I'll do a tree inventory, and they may or may not have at least a general, like very high level site plan of what they want to put on the site. I may look at that and say, based on this and based on the tree condition, I see here's the list of tree removals, and here's what you'll have to do if you want to save some of these trees. And these trees, I really recommend you try to design around them because that will make your project look more favorable to the jurisdiction and to the public. It's a tree inventory plus preliminary recommendations. There's not going to be a report at this stage because they're not heading into that level of permitting yet. And then I had a third tier, which is maybe like level 2.5. The most detailed tier I've done for a property that has not been officially purchased yet, remember this is still escrow, is like a tree inventory plus appraisals. This was a client who was coming in on this property, and this particular city requires appraisals. So they knew that if they wanted to take out a certain number of trees, that they would need to pay that appraised value. So they wanted to know, if we had to remove these trees, is the project economically feasible? So the client and I worked on a scope of work together for this. We ultimately decided that I would do a rough tree inventory. I would identify the species, I would estimate the trunk diameters, and I would roughly do an appraisal for them. And for the purposes of this appraisal, I just assumed that the condition was 70%. Just average it out. So I did run those numbers for them, and I gave them a total at the end, and I identified the trees that would most likely have to go because they weren't along the perimeter of the property, and this was a really high density development. And they ultimately bought that property, and I went back and I did a normal tree inventory. That property has not yet been developed. I think I started that. They bought the property 3 years ago, maybe. Um, I did the report maybe 2 years ago. I think they're trying to sell the property to someone else. So yeah, this stuff takes it stretches out quite a bit. So this last section to wrap up the video is what I've learned about doing consulting services during the escrow period. And there's two things. So the first part is having something in writing. The goal of the escrow period is for them to have time to do their due diligence, identify issues with the property that the seller either isn't telling them or that the seller doesn't know about. So they can walk into this purchase with full information. And they're going to for the most part, hire their own experts. And that can be house inspection, engineers, arborists, like all kinds of things. So they can use this time to do all that. If you're going to do these services, you have to be responsive. Oftentimes, it might go something like they get a house inspection, and the house inspector is a super generalist, and that person recommends looking at the trees. So then they're going to hire arborists, but by this time, maybe they're like halfway through, if not shorter, and they're running out of time. So when someone wants an escrow inspection, it's like within the next day or two. They want something in writing in case, especially if you are suggesting that they do some kind of work to mitigate problems. What the buyer needs is something in writing so that they can present it to the seller and negotiate from there. You can use this to make sure that you get paid. So the second part, because the buyer is not committed to purchasing that property, and because sometimes you're being contacted by their real estate agent, it's really important to make sure you set up your terms to get paid. When I was working at the tree service, there were enough times to stand out in my mind that a prospective buyer would get the tree service to put together estimate for tree work. They would use that for negotiations, and then they may or may not buy the property. But either way, because there's the person who's actually paying the bill, which is the person who wants to buy the property, and there's a real estate agent, there would be times where it would be difficult to get paid because maybe that buyer decided against the property and they don't want to spend money they don't want to actually pay their bills. And maybe you can't get through to them because you had this real estate agent acting in the middle. And if you're someone who's giving estimates as part of this process, you should be paid for that. Just because they take your estimate and use it to negotiate doesn't mean that they're going to come and use your service in the future. It's possible that maybe you're a higher end tree company and your prices are going to be higher. So in a way, it behooves them to get the highest proposal possible and use that to negotiate with the sellers. Whereas then, even if they do buy the property, maybe they're just going to hire the cheapest bidder, right? So it's important, I feel like, to get paid for your time for these appointments because you are really assisting that prospective buyer on securing a better price for the property. Some of these prospective buyers, especially if they're not very ethical, they may try not to pay your bill, especially if they're not gonna buy that property because they may be doing this process over and over with multiple properties. That report or that estimate, whatever you're gonna give them in writing, that's gonna be your leverage to get paid. The client who's looking at buying this property, their escrow period is fixed. So if they don't pay for you and your observations, do they have enough time to find another arborist? And maybe that other arborist is going to say something different from you. So holding out on giving them anything in writing is probably the best leverage you have. And these clients should be prepared to do that. They should be bringing payment like in the form of a check or something, or just everything moves fast during this time. So these people are accustomed to it. And that would be my suggestion is even if your policy is to wait until you deliver the work to get paid, I think real estate is one of those situations where it is really helpful to get paid before you deliver. Those are my experiences doing escrow kind of inspections. I don't get called too much just because they usually want someone who can also give a proposal for tree work. So I would typically refer that to other people unless they wanted something specifically related to construction or development and stuff like that.